So we had Alberta. Okay, so I do have to go over here. Alberta, Canada, Saudi Arabia. We have Pittsburgh, Chicago, Northern Ireland, Des Moines, Iowa, Washington, D.C. I'm just kidding. Des Moines is fine. Idaho, Virginia, Los Angeles, Texas, California, Oregon, Kansas, Japan, Tokyo, Japan. What time is it in Tokyo? Holy cow. Malaysia, Wisconsin, Lincoln, Nebraska. Just kind of give a sense for people all over the world. Hungary. Oh, no, you are hungry. Somebody said they were hungry, not from Hungary. Belgium, which is good. All right, cool. So let me close that down.
They said our orange wall makes them hungry.
So welcome, everybody, to our Myers-Briggs Enneagram mashup tonight. We're going to have you work with us in creating this experience. We have Dr. Beatrice Chestnut with us tonight. I got the doctor in there, Beatrice. I love when I do that. Welcome. Dr. Chestnut is an Enneagram expert. She's an author of 2 books on the Enneagram, The Complete Enneagram and 9 Types of Leadership. And I'm sure she'll be an author of more books if she can write them, which would be awesome.
Well, if she can squeeze them in her incredibly busy schedule, flying all over the world, giving lectures and seminars on the Enneagram.
She also created a program with us here at Personality Hacker called the Enneagram Roadmap, which is a program going into the Enneagram system and how you can use it to grow personally. So I might mention a little bit about that later. And this is a little bit of a celebration of that because we're in the midst of relaunching that or putting some attention to it because we're really excited about the Enneagram right now. So what we want to do tonight, Beatrice, is we want to do a mashup with you where we take questions from people and we find, it might just be direct Enneagram questions that we can answer. There might be some Myers-Briggs questions that we can help feel and answer. And then there might be some mashup questions. So I have basically 3 styles of questions that we're looking for that I think would be really good to direct this conversation. The first is questions about the Enneagram system that you use and the subtypes that you speak about. So people probably have some questions. Maybe they've read your book. Maybe they have watched some of the videos that we've created together. Maybe they've seen some of the videos you've created on your own. They want to ask a little bit more about this idea of subtypes. What does that mean and the nuance around that? The other is if they have any questions about the specific program or books you've created, like some of your content, we can ask questions around that. And then the third is if there's any mashup questions. So if you have a mashup question, feel free to ask that tonight to Beatrice and us. The only thing we ask is that the thing that will make that successful, though, is if you know your type in both systems. So if you're like, I'm not sure if I'm an ENFP or an ENTP, but I'm pretty sure I'm a 9, well, it's going to be hard for us to give some help to that. If you know your type, it's going to help us speak to that better, right? If you're going between 2 types, you're totally unsure, it's going to be difficult for us to field some of those questions and help you just because we'll spend most of the time trying to figure out help you arrive at a type rather than talking about maybe the growth opportunities in those types. So, and then, and you have something else you want to say too, right?
Yeah, well, I want to make sure you feel complete.
I feel complete. Let's kind of freeform it and keep going, yeah.
All right, so this webinar is part so that you guys can ask questions, but also we're just always super excited when we have Beatrice around because we want to learn from her since she's the expert and we're always hungry for more content. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to start out with Beatrice giving a little bit of information around instincts. And the reason why is we were having a conversation a couple days ago about this idea of how we've seen a trend, especially since subtypes have become so much more popular. And that probably wasn't the case before. It didn't seem like I ever heard of subtypes, and then I heard of them from you, and now I'm seeing them everywhere. So it's become a big deal. And it means that in sort of the collective unconscious of everybody who's into typology, there seems to be like a desire to have some mastery around this concept. And I've noticed that when people talk about the instincts, so those would be like social, sexual, and self-preservation, they talk about them very disembodied from type. And we had a conversation not that long ago about how that can actually be a bit of a tricky road. So I thought maybe we could start out this webinar with Beatrice maybe teaching a little bit of content, maybe talking a little bit about that phenomenon and about like when is it appropriate to do that and inappropriate to do that. And then we can head on to other questions for Beatrice or for mashup or whatever. Does that work out for everybody? Does that work?
Works for me. I don't have to do the teaching, so yeah, I'm on board. Beatrice,
works for me. Okay. Yeah. I can talk all day about the subtypes.
I know you can, which is why we love you. Okay, so what we're going to do then is we're going to actually hand the mic over to you and have you talk a little bit about that concept of instincts and the relationship to the types. So,
okay, the instincts, the types, and the subtypes.
Yes. And
Okay.
specifically that concept of like, when is it okay? Like, like, take for example, let me give you an example. I'm a sexual 3. When does the law of diminishing returns show up about me talking about being a sexual dominant? And now I'm entering territory where I'm actually not representing myself accurately, because being a sexual 3 is actually closer to accurate, not just being sexual dominant. So like, where exactly is it that like I'm going to need to know the subtype in order to be accurate about my self-assessment?
And we may have a couple new people that are a little new to the Enneagram, so you might want to just give a little bit of orientation quickly before we dive right into the concept.
Yeah, I think it's always good to define our terms.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Right.
And thanks for doing this. I love talking with you guys always, and your amazing community of people who I'm meeting more and more of all the time. So this is great. So the subtypes are a really important aspect of the Enneagram, and I'm always happy to talk about them because I think there's a lot of confusion out there about the subtypes and the instincts, and I'll explain a little bit why I think that is. So there are 9 types. A lot of people usually know that, of the Enneagram types. There are 3 types that are sort of more based in the head, 3 types that are more based in the heart center of intelligence, and 3 types that are more based in the body center of intelligence. And these 9 types are characterized by specific patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And they're the way we get around in the world. But we mistakenly identify with our personality and think that's who we are, when really we're much more than that. And knowing about your personality is a great path to understanding yourself at a deeper level, and recognizing that your personality is not all of who you are. And one of the reasons why I like the way you guys talk about Myers-Briggs is it's a growth path, as is the Enneagram. So there are 9 types, and there are 3 instincts. Now, one place the confusion sometimes comes in is people who've studied the Enneagram, especially based on the work of Riso and Hudson and their book, The Wisdom of the Enneagram, sometimes call what I call the subtypes, which is basically the 3 versions of each of the 9 types. So there are 3 1s, 3 2s, 3 3s, 3 4s, and on, based on whether your self-preservation instinct is most dominant, your social instinct is more dominant, or your sexual instinct is more dominant. And what happened when Riso and Hudson wrote Wisdom of the Enneagram is they called the wings the subtypes. Now, I don't believe that wings are subtypes. I don't believe there's something we can say like a 4 with a 5 wing that everybody who's a 4 who might relate to 5 looks the same as. I just don't, I think wings color our main type. I definitely think that the circle is a spectrum. So wings flavor who we are, but I think it's really fluid depending on our individual histories and just how we've lived our life and who we are. So while I do think wings color our main type, I more than that think wings are developmental opportunities, like ways that I'm a 2, so sometimes it helps me to stretch into my 3 winged if I need to balance myself out, if I'm getting too much into a mood and not getting things done. Wings can also help us grow in terms of their access points that are right nearby, and usually they're gentle growth steps, as opposed to the arrow line points, which are more radical growth steps. But getting back to subtypes, because they called the wings subtypes in their book, The Wisdom of the Enneagram, they called what I call subtypes instinctual variants, right? So a lot of people in the Enneagram community still call what I call the subtypes instinctual variants because they're students of Riso and Hudson. And that's okay, except for the fact that then it makes it hard for us to talk to each other and know what we mean, because when people refer to the 27 subtypes as instincts, I don't know whether they mean the 27 subtypes or these 3 groupings of instincts in terms of self-preservation, dominant, social, or sexual. So what I'm going to talk about is the instincts as these kind of groupings of instincts or instinctual drives or biological imperatives. They're the animal wisdom part of us. They're the part of us that's connected to our reptilian brain. They're our most automatic animal-like reactions that we have. and they're very, very fast. If a thought is the speed of X and a feeling is the speed of 10X, an instinctual reaction is 100X. And so they're so fast that that we can't really self-observe them until after they've already happened. But the instincts are important because they're the animal part of us. They're located in the belly center, and they're a part of how our personality operates. Now, the instincts aren't bad. Our animal wisdom is a good thing. But when we're really healthy, our animal instincts kind of just flow as needed, you know? So if I'm in trouble, my self-preservation instinct might get triggered. If I am in a situation where it might help me to survive, to be connected to a group or a tribe, my social instinct might get activated. If there's a way that connecting to someone else really deeply and creating a really strong bond might help me survive, my sexual instinct would get activated. That would be how it would be just if we were sort of healthy people in touch with our animal parts. But when instincts are embedded in personality, by definition, they are influenced by our type patterns, and especially the passion of the type. And some of you may know the passion of the type is sometimes called the chief feature. It's a central emotional motivator. It's the same as the 7 deadly sins, plus fear and deceit. Each type has a specific passion, and part of why the passion is so important is it's often unconscious, and it's part of the lower emotional center that really drives a lot of our conditioned behavior in terms of what we tend to be motivated to do. So I'm a 2, and my passion is pride. And so when I first learned the Enneagram, I didn't really get pride because, you know, I had felt sort of insecure in my life, and I didn't really always puff myself up and elevate myself and think of myself as being really important. But when I finally realized what pride really is, which is kind of always kind of thinking about how you're impacting other people, whether other people like you, how you're going to meet everybody's needs, and become important that way. But you have no needs as a 2. I felt like I had no need. I'm here to meet your needs, but I have no needs. That's a position of pride that's making myself a little bit better than everybody else. When in truth, I'm just me. I'm not necessarily more important than anybody else. So the passion is very important when it mixes with whichever instinct is dominant in your experience. And we all have all 3 instincts if we're alive, but one of them tends to dominate our experience. One tends to be prominent. We're out of balance in that way, just like we're out of balance when we come from more from one center of intelligence than the other 2. I'm 2, I come more from my emotions, more from my heart center. So I tend to be a little out of balance in that sometimes when I think I'm being objective, I'm actually thinking with my feelings. So the fact that we all have all 3 instincts, but one of them tends to dominate our experience more than the other is just another aspect of being a little bit out of balance in personality. And then learning about that imbalance and seeing it in action and knowing ourselves more is one of the ways we get more in balance as we come to know ourselves, and then we can more consciously moderate our behavior in ways that create more balance and less automatic reactivity based on what our dominant instinct is and what our lower emotional patterns are. So these 3 instincts are really important. And they're really important to understand what they are and how they operate in you. And for myself, I'm a self-preservation dominant. Now, that was hard for me to figure out. So if you're not sure what your dominant instinct is, don't worry. Think of it as a process. Now, sometimes I will tell you this, heart types can overestimate if they're sexual dominant. Right? Because heart types are oriented toward connecting with other people. That's just part of being a heart type, 2s, 3s, and 4s, right? As a 2, I'm very oriented toward creating connections with other people, sometimes intense connections, that's really, really a strong focus of connection for me as a 2. Sometimes 2s and 4s especially can think they're sexual dominance when really they're just being a heart type. And that's what kind of was for me. I sort of thought, well, I'm kind of neurotic about creating strong emotional bonds with people and strong, all kinds of bonds. So I thought I might be asexual. Well, when I learned the approach to the subtypes that I teach and write about, which is derived from the work of Claudio Naranjo, who's one of the seminal Enneagram authors. He's the one who really gave us the version of the 9 types that we use today, of course, based on Oscar Ichazo's work. When I learned this approach to the subtypes in 2004, it was really different than everything I had heard before on subtypes. So one reason there's confusion out there about the subtypes is different teachers in the Enneagram world teach different things about the instincts and the subtypes. Some of them emphasize the instincts, as Antonia says, like disembodied from the subtypes, you know, sort of apart as their own thing. And I think to a degree, they can be studied and observed and worked with on their own, but to a limited degree. Because what happens is, first of all, it can be confusing to tell which dominant instinct you are. Like I just said, the heart types tend to think they're sexual when they sometimes aren't, just because they think of sexual as being about connection, but heart types are about connection. But it's hard to tell sometimes. Like I didn't really know I was a self-preservation dominant person until one of, you know, Claudio Naranjo and his teachers told me that's what they observed in me in 2004. And that was interesting to me because I never really related to the description of what the self-preservation instinct is all about. Now there is a description, right? Self-preservation instinct dominant people tend generally to be oriented toward issues of safety, security, structure, organization. Do I have enough resources? You know, and that can be, do I have enough money in the bank? Do I have enough food in the refrigerator? But the problem is what I see happening over and over again, even with people who know the Enneagram pretty well, is they really figure out what subtype they are based on what instinct they think is dominant in their experience. And they base their evaluation of what subtype is dominant on things like, you know, do I bring a lot of stuff on a trip with me? You know, or do I make intense eye contact with people? You know, if I bring a lot of stuff on a trip with me, then I must be self-preservation dominant. If I have really intense eye contact with people, if I'm really connected to my partner, I must be sexual. If I love to join groups, then I must be social. If I don't like to join groups, then I can't be social. And all of these are problematic because once you combine the dominant instinct, once you embed it in the personality structure, once you know, which is where it lives in real people, like our instincts are always, as humans, they're always interconnected with our emotional patterns and our mental patterns. They just don't show up in our lives. We can't look at them in isolation. And so it's a little bit problematic to figure out what subtype you are and even what dominant instinct you are just based on self-observation, because it's kind of tricky. I suggest learning about the 27 subtypes, which result from when we look at the 9 types and we recognize that there are 3 versions of each of those 9 types based on whether your self-preservation instinct is dominant in your experience, your social instinct is dominant, or your sexual instinct is dominant. Now, again, I advise trying not to go in through the door of the instinct of figuring out, oh, I like to join groups, so I must be social, because it's a kind of addition. It's like, well, I'm a 3 and I like to join groups, so I must be a social 3. And it's just not that simple. The truth is it's more of an alchemical mixture. Like you're not really sure what you get when you mix, you know, type 6 and the passion of fear with the social instinct. And one of the things I love about Claudio Naranjo's descriptions of the 27 subtypes, which are the ones I've used and elaborated on, is they were based on his, I think, observing hundreds of people go through his many trainings over like 30 years. And I think also because he's a psychiatrist and he knows a lot about, you know, human behavior and spirituality, I think he was able to really clearly delineate, wow, the 3 4s seem to show up in these 3 versions. And I can see how the self-preservation instinct is mixing with envy in the 4 to kind of create this focus of attention that's more specific and more defined than just the general category of type 4. So I think the subtypes are really important because they help us differentiate why 2 people of the same type can look really different. And I think it's a much better differentiator than wings. A lot of people say, oh, well, I'm a 7 with a 6 wing. And that's why I look different than a 7 with an 8 wing. But the problem is wings aren't really that determinate. they're just more fluid. You know, I'm a 2, you could say I'm a 2 with a 1 wing, but I think I have both wings. And one of the reasons why the 1 is more prominent in my experience sometimes is I grew up in a family of 4, 2 of which were 1s, right? So my whole life, I'm trying to relate to my father and my brother, my only sibling, and they're both 1s. So isn't it going to make sense that I'm kind of 1-ish? Now you could call that a 1 wing, but the 1 and the way the 1 shows up in me is going to be different than the way it shows up in another 2, or the way it shows up in a 9. So I just don't think 1s are the way to go when we're really trying to figure out, okay, why are 2 7s different? Why are 2 6s so different? I think the subtypes are the explanation for why 2 people of 1 type look really different, because they have different dominant instincts. And it's really dangerous to focus too much on what you think of as the definition of the instincts, because we can only kind of go so far with a sort of more general description of the instincts. Like I said, self-preservation dominants tend to be oriented towards safety and security. But for instance, when you mix self-preservation with 4, you get a kind of interesting thing where 4s kind of put themselves in danger. Self-preservation 4s are tough on themselves. They suffer a lot and they internalize that suffering, and they kind of don't try to make themselves feel better. So that's a kind of a tricky thing. And so it's not necessarily what you would think. Same with self-pres 2, which is my type. There's a way that I wasn't good at with money at all. I'm still like, I'm really self-indulgent. I don't save. I don't really, there's a way that, then there's a reason why, because of what my subtype is. But for instance, joining groups, like my brother is a social 1 for sure, but he's never in the middle of a group. He's always outside the group. And there's a reason for that. If you know what a social 1 is all about, if you know how the social dominant instinct mixes with type 1. So I think it's just really important to learn about the instincts. Like the social instinct tends to be oriented toward how am I getting along with the group or the community or the family or the team? How am I positioned? What's my reputation like? How important am I? How much power do I have? But it looks different depending on what type you are. So it's really dangerous to just go in a simplistic way of like, whether I like groups or not, or how comfortable I feel, at a party or not. I think like for me, I'm a self-preservation dominant. When I go to a party, I don't necessarily go to the food table first. I kind of look because I'm self-preservation and sometimes I have a little bit of fearfulness going into a party, I look for one person I can connect with. Now, some people might say that means I'm sexual, but so that's what I mean. It's a little bit tricky to rely too much on the definition of the instinct when you're looking for what your dominant instinct is and thus what your subtype is.
Yeah.
I recommend going in through the door of subtype.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing then is, because I was trying to figure out where the sort of like like I said, the law of diminishing returns on talking about the instincts is disembodied from the types, where basically where that line was. And what I'm hearing you say, if I'm getting this accurately, is when you only have conversations around the instincts being disembodied, it can become confusing to anybody who's still in a diagnostic phase trying to figure out their subtype. Because there are certain characteristics that we apply to them that may counterintuitively show up in other subtypes that are not using that instinct as their dominant instinct. Right. And so once you know your subtype, like once you're very confident, at that point, it's almost like you can kind of go disembodied a little bit more and sort of see how your instinct is impacting you. Right. But you don't want to bring it into really, like that disembodied element, you don't want to bring into really into the conversation, because it actually can be quite confusing when you're trying to figure out your type.
Right.
Okay. Right. And basically what you're talking about, that concept of the wings, and adding the component of instincts as opposed to relying on wings for diagnosing one's type, that totally mirrors my experience. Because I went between 3, 7, and 8 for so long, and I just kind of like shrugged at a certain point. I went, I guess I'm a 3. But of course now I realize that almost every description is a description of a social 3. Right. And so I just didn't really resonate with all of those. But the the passion, it's vanity, right, for 3s. And so the passion, like all the other stuff, all the like the icky stuff, I was like, yeah, it's me. But just the general just type descriptions never truly landed. And I tried to do wings to try to figure out if like, well, am I a 3-wing 2? Am I 3-wing 4? Maybe I'm a 3-wing 4, and that's what's making me not want to resonate fully with that description because I want to be inscrutable, right, with my 4 wing. I
Right.
all sorts of things. And then I read sexual 3 and I went, that's what's going on. That's it right there. And all of a sudden 3 just made total sense. And I kind of abandoned wings at that point. I don't really think of them anymore, even though I know that they come in, like you said, growth opportunities for some balance. But this idea of using it to fully rest into my 3 description, sexual 3 was like on the money. So that resonates with my experience too. So thank you for explaining that, because I've been trying to figure out where that delineation line was. Do you feel complete talking about that, or did you want to, did you have something you were about to say?
No, I think that was really good clarification.
Okay.
No, I think that's good. I want to stop, unless you feel like you need to say more, Beatrice.
Yeah, you feel good about that? All right.
A kind of a meta question that I think a lot of people are either asking or probably want to ask, or is on top of mind, whether they're watching live or they're watching the recording. Could you just speak to your feelings or your thoughts around how do I discover my type around a test? Like online tests, there's a new app that's out now. There's all sorts of tools that are starting to be available. What has been your experience with these types of tools to test yourself online? Maybe just give us some guidelines, things we could be thinking about in general, because I know there's like a lot of specific test questions, but let's just speak to it at kind of a meta level as we get to the content of some of the other questions.
Sure. So, I mean, I think at a certain level, it's really important for people to take responsibility for finding their type themselves. I think a lot of times, and it's just natural, we want an authority to tell us what type we are, or we want a test to tell us what type we are. And we give over our power and authority to a test or another person because, you know, we want the answer, and sometimes we don't have confidence that we can get there ourselves. And so I like to tell people that finding your type is a process. And I would think of it as finding different data points and then really doing some self-reflective work to figure out what makes the most sense to you. You know, I actually did have an authority tell me in the beginning what type they were. They thought I was. David Daniels, who was my first Enneagram teacher, told me he thought I was a 2. But I went home and I got Helen Palmer's first book, which is the book that was out then. And I read about 2. And I kind of said, does this match my experience or not? Now, it's a tricky thing because a lot of us, when we try to do that, there may be 1 or 2 or 3 types that we resonate with, and it can be hard to tease apart, you know, which one is the real type. And so again, that's why I say, give yourself some time and space to have a process around it. Now, the sad truth is most of the Enneagram tests out there that you find online when you Google Enneagram test are not accurate.
Yeah, it's the same thing with Myers-Briggs. It's just
they're really not. And especially some of the most popular ones that aren't that expensive that everybody takes, you know, I hear all the time, like, oh, I took this test and I came out as this. And, you know, it's almost meaningless because sometimes there's a bar graph and all 3 are the same. And I mean, again, if you look at that as, okay, 1 data point, you know, that's 1 piece of data, but not as the final answer, it can be okay to take a test. But I think it's important to always put that through your own filter. It's also good to, you know, find someone who knows the Enneagram really well, but make sure it's someone who really knows it and really knows it well. You know, like a coach or a teacher who can help guide you. You know, I do typing interviews. Some of my colleagues do typing interviews. My teaching partner and I have a course that we call Providing Powerful Enneagram Solutions, that where we teach people to type and assess people. And we provide an interview and multiple methods. We have a flow chart, partly because we want to train Enneagram practitioners to do it kind of the hard way, but learn the Enneagram really, really deeply and really, really well so they can be a check on a test. So, you know, they can, if you do an interview with people, they can take a test and you can take that into account. You know, the person can say, well, I took this test and I came out as this, and I took this test and I came out as this. Again, as long as you don't look at that at the final answer. And then you can take an interview with a person who knows it really well. But again, depending on who they are and their credentials, they might be wrong too. So it's really important to see it as a process to get different data points. Sometimes you can sort of do reading yourself, ask someone who knows you really, really well, who you trust, to share that kind of, and ask for feedback. But think of it as a process, and don't rely on any one test, and let it be the first sort of chapter of your self-development path, is learning about what type you are, reading different descriptions, asking yourself, is that really me, or is that who I want to be seen as? Or if I read an Enneagram description and I really don't like it, and maybe it is you, and it's triggering and pushing some buttons about what you don't want to see in yourself, and can you be open enough to consider that? But I do think typing is a big issue, and my teaching partner and I are working on new methods also as part of this course, what we call typing and assessment, providing solutions. So it is a process. It's not easy, but I think it's one of the things that's great about the Enneagram is it's complex. And there is a bit of a price to admission. And I would hope people would be willing to kind of engage in that as an interesting challenge, and not as something where, okay, I just want someone to tell me what the answer is.
I think that's a really good point. Like with Myers-Briggs, because it's a developed system in the last 100 years. It came from some of Jung's work. It's a little tightened up. It's like a little bit more, like it had a source, right, that we can point to. So it's kind of like an official way to see it. I think one of the challenges of the Enneagram is half the time we spend syncing up what we mean in our definitions, and okay, what box are we in right now that we're talking about? It's a lot of orientation time is spent. And in fact, I'm going to ask you an orientation question again, just to help people be able to have a point where they're at. So the Jen writes in and says, if wings aren't as reliable to understand different type flavors as subtypes are, what are your thoughts about tri-type? And I thought you could just briefly mention this, so a lot of people are familiar with tri-type. So you have an orientation point of where we're at right now from your standpoint.
Yeah. So I don't use tri-type. I don't think it's helpful. I think when you use the Enneagram as a growth tool, the place to start is working on your main type. That's where you start. And too often what I see happening when people like tri-type is they distract themselves from the really important work of working with their main type. I mean, you could spend 10 years just working with your main type and you still have more to do. But what happens is when people like tri-type, they tend to say, oh, well, that behavior I just did, that wasn't my main type. That was my so if I'm a 4, oh, I have a 7 in my tri-type. That's my 7. Well, how do you know that's your 7 and not just another part of your 4? What I find is people distract themselves from the real work of the Enneagram, which is using your main type to really self-observe. How is your passion activating at all the time? How are your type patterns, your unconscious type patterns, manifesting all the time? And if you're outsourcing some of your behavior to a second or third type, you're not really going to be doing the work. You're going to be finding an escape ramp to stuff that you don't want to see as part of your main type. It's like, how do you know? People, like, it contributes to these horrible misconceptions and stereotypes about the types. For instance, people say, well, I'm a 4, and so if I did something really joyful, that must be 7. It's like, 4s can't be joyful? Like, that's crazy. And I see people all the time on the internet saying, if you're happy, you can't be a 4. And that's just wrong. And it does real damage to 4s, to people are 4s, to the Enneagram system as a whole, because you're taking it lightly, you're stereotyping it. And so I just don't think tri-type helps you on your self-growth path. I think it actually takes you away from doing the really main work of really seeing how your main type, I mean, you could spend a whole life on your main type. Now, secondarily, I think looking at the arrow line points is important. And so I think that if you're working with tri-type, it's like a way of owning some of what's going on with your main type. And so I also think, just historically, I learned tri-fix from Echazo's people. And I think there was something to that, but Echazo's program was very elaborated and it had a lot going on in it that people who kind of took trifix out of it and changed it into tri-type didn't understand. They didn't understand the base of it, or they weren't using the foundation that was part of trifix. So I think they tried to create something, and, you know, I'm not saying there isn't some pattern to it that people find interesting. I'm just saying, for me, the main question is always, does this piece of theory help me to grow or distract me from my main growth tasks? And for me, tri-type is a distraction, and it's part of this, something I love that you say, Antonia, this sort of fixation on diagnosis, on diagnostic, on, oh, I'm a 6 with a 5 wing, I'm a 6, 8, 3. It's like is all those aspects getting you anywhere, or are they just sort of descriptive at a level that actually keeps you from going deeper into, if you're a 6, what's going on with you all the time? What are you self-observing? How does fear manifest in your life? And what are you doing? And how can you be more conscious of your unconscious patterns? Those are the questions. And if you're saying, oh, that's my 8, how do you know? I just think I'm obviously not a big fan.
Well,
thank you for being honest.
Yes, thank you very much. And actually, what's interesting about that is there's so we get a lot of questions. I mean, to kind of give a corollary on our side, is socionics. We get a lot of questions about socionics, and socionics, probably like you with tri-type and it sounds like tri-type came from trifix, which sounds like that's a whole, I don't even know what that is, but that sounds like it's probably very deep, very interesting.
Different.
Lots of stuff going on. And the same thing with socionics. Socionics is very complex. There's a lot going on to it, and there's a lot of merit to it too. And I don't think it's that, with our opinion about socionics, it's not like we don't think it's true or there's nothing there. It's that because we come from a personal development framework, it's so complex, it hogs resource that we feel could be applied to growth work. And then for me, because I've studied socionics, I think it's fascinating. There's lots of cool stuff in there. There's like things like called quadras, which are really fascinating and I think have a lot of merit to them, and lots of cool stuff in there. And when people ask me about it, I always say, well, did you do the work of developing your auxiliary process? Right? Like, that's the first question. Did you do the work of your type?
Right.
And once you feel like you've hit a lot of diminishing returns on that, once you feel like, like you've hit a place where you've really done some work here, then definitely branch out to more complex, complicated, like get into more meat if you are, if your growth is getting to a place where you're stagnating. Go find the tools that you need in order to continue your growth. But like you said, I mean, I feel the same way about being an ENTP. Truly developing that co-pilot or auxiliary process for me took me about a decade. It took me about 10 years. And that was just the first step, right? And so I think I kind of understand what you're saying. I think it's probably the philosophy of the growth mindset, which is getting into a place of like continually going down the rabbit holes of systems and models is very intellectually appeasing, right? Like it sates our mind. But I think doing the growth work and making sure that we don't allow all the energy to be hogged in the intellectual practice, and make sure that we've got that resource for the developmental work is what satisfies our soul. And so I think it's like whether or not you're using models to just feed the mind, or if you're using them also to feed the soul. And it kind of sounds like that's the direction you're coming from as well. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I like that. I like that way of putting it.
Cool.
All right. Okay.
Well, can I go into some more questions?
Absolutely.
Keep
Go
rolling.
questions.
I don't want to interrupt anybody.
Keep rolling.
So Michael asks, we're going to get into some other questions here. Thank you, by the way, Beatrice. I'm curious about Dr. Chestnut's MBTI type and how Enneagram complements Jungian typology. All very interesting. What do you identify with in the Myers-Briggs system, Beatrice?
I'm an ENFP.
I like that. That's a good type. I can resonate with that one. And
I recently I taught a class, and my TA in the class did a whole thing on Myers-Briggs because she's really into it, and it was fantastic, Renata. And so she took the class through how you figure out your Myers-Briggs type. And so I did it again, and I came out at ENFP again. So it's been recently confirmed.
Awesome. That's great. Just to people watching, just a quick housekeeping note. If you're new, you've joined us new, there's a lot of chats coming through. So if you're watching live and you have a question, just put question in all caps, a colon, so I can scan quickly and find those questions readily. All right, so we have a question.
Yeah, let's go into the Q&A part, actually.
All right. Anonymous asks, I hope it's not the group Anonymous.
Yeah.
Differences between 9 wing 1 and 1 wing 9. Also difference between ENFJ and INFJ when life circumstances require. So I'm actually going to skip past this, first of all, because you're anonymous. So I don't even know who you are. So let's try to put your names in so we can identify those. The other thing is we already kind of talked about the wings a little bit. And also, if you're going to, another housekeeping thing is you're going to ask a question about Myers-Briggs and Enneagram. Instead of comparing and contrasting types within those systems, it'd be good to know what your type is in each system, so we can talk about the comparisons between those two things. So my apologies for not vetting that a little better. Just a quick general question would be great. Dana asks, hi, what's your recommended growth path for social fives? You have kind of a general statement around that.
Social fives. Well, my teaching partner is a social five, so this is a type I've become more familiar with in recent years. And he's one of my favorite people. I would say for social fives, social five is the prototype of the spiritual bypasser. And this can also be an intellectual bypasser. So someone who gets really focused on knowledge and can intellectualize things and get really interested in things like spirituality, like typologies, different kinds of systems, but engage mainly or only from an intellectual level. And it's important for social fives to bring the knowledge into their life more deeply. So spiritual bypassing is when we bypass our psychological work and try to just sort of move beyond and above by doing either spiritual work, and it can be like someone who's deeply into a spiritual teacher or spiritual tradition, or even someone who's into something like astrology or Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram, and intellectually engaging with it, but not really living it. And so it's important because like social fives can get really connected to other people who could share their interests and their passions and their ideals. They look for meaning in life because there's a fear that life is meaningless, and meaning comes through these super ideals and these social causes sometimes, and intellectual interests that they get really passionate about. They can look kind of 7-ish actually. But the social five needs to get more in touch with emotions. They can be actually the least emotional of all 27 subtypes, and get more in touch with emotions, get more in touch with lived experience in everyday life. They can be connected to people that they share interest with at a distance, but not that connected with people in their everyday life that really care about them or that they care about, but they don't really engage at a heart level or at the level of sort of lived everyday life experience. So it's taking it out, balancing the strong intellectual gifts and interests with being more, coming more from the heart, connecting more with people in different ways, and not just through shared interests.
Do you want me not to ask this, or do you want me to ask this?
Maybe
I don't know what
not.
this means.
Yeah, sorry. we're vetting questions right now. I'm like listening to you, but I'm also trying to figure out.
If you can listen to her, I realized you were looking at this, so I started listening to her, so I left track of this. So we need to pick who's going to do what. So you can listen to what she's saying,
but
and I'll look at questions that I can get
because there's a lot of them coming in.
I love how honest and authentic you guys are.
Always.
Big part of your charm.
If people cannot deal with radical honesty, they cannot deal with us.
Yeah.
So if you can pay attention to her, that would be helpful for me to be able to pay attention. Then I'll pay attention to this. I won't have to have my ear out for what she's saying.
I noticed there was a lot of things about countertypes.
Countertypes. That was what I was just about to say. There's a bunch of people like countertypes.
So let's just talk about countertypes then.
Yeah.
Like I was going to get down that on the list, but let's just jump right to it. Countertypes.
One of my favorite topics, because this is a way that a lot of people get mistyped. So for each of the 9 types, there are 3 subtypes, based on which of these 3 instincts is dominant in your experience and how that mixes up with your type. So the subtypes are great because they give you more specific categories in the main type. It's like using the 9 types alone is sort of like using a blunt instrument or having a map that isn't that well defined. When you add the subtypes in, there's a lot more definition and specificity. And so it makes it actually easier to find your type, because let's say you can't decide if you're a 2 or a 6. If you look at the 3 subtypes of 6 and how those are described, you can be like, do I fit in one of those 3 categories? Versus if I look at the 3 subtypes of 2, usually you'll be like, I don't really fit in any of those 6s, but oh, there's one over here in 2 that exactly describes me. So the subtypes are important. Now for each of the 9 types, there are 3 subtypes, and one of those 3 is what we call a countertype. It's a subtype that kind of goes against the main flow, energetic flow of the type. For instance, 5s, for instance, tend to withdraw. They tend to be a little bit more away. They move away from people, just as a sort of a fundamental move. The sexual 5 is the countertype, because the sexual instinct is something that wants to go toward people. And, it's this instinctual drive to merge or fuse or connect with somebody else at a deep level. And remember, the sexual instinct is it's more about, instinctual connection. We're not talking about romance here. We're talking about sex, but it's more than sex. It's the energy behind creation. It's the energy behind, it's a kind of intensity of connection that's sexual, but more than sexual, but not so much about love and romance. It's more body-based. It's more instinctual. So you've got the sexual instinct that's moving out toward other people, and you've got the 5 energy that's moving away. Now, when those are going against each other, that's when you get the countertype. So the sexual 5 is the countertype of type 5. Now, the reason why it's really important to know countertypes is oftentimes the countertype doesn't look a lot like what you think the main type looks like. And so those people often can't find themselves. So a sexual 5 might mistype themselves even as a 4, because even though 4s are really different than 5s, and they tend to be more in their emotions than even the sexual 5. The sexual 5 is a 5 that tends to be more in touch with their emotions. And so they may not relate to some of the typical 5 descriptions. And so all of the types have this countertype. Now, there is one countertype that's kind of famous in Enneagram circles, and that's the sexual 6, because a lot of people who don't even know what a countertype is know about a counterphobic 6. And 6s come in 3 versions, like all the other types. And 2 of the versions kind of go with the ideas of fight or flight as 2 basic reactions to fear. You either want to run away, or you want to kind of fight and go toward the source of fear with strength. And the counterphobic 6 is a 6 that goes against fear with strength. And so we often see a counterphobic 6 as someone who's a real contrarian, who rebels more, who doesn't really feel the fear, but kind of gets strong and tough to go out to meet the source of fear, actually likes dancing with danger. That's the counterphobic 6, and it's just a 6 that goes against fear. And so it's the most obvious of the countertypes, that it goes against fear with strength. But every type has a countertype. And if you're one of those countertypes, it could be likely that you've struggled to find your type, or you've been mistyped as another type completely, because a lot of Enneagram teachers and writers don't even know about some of the countertypes, because unfortunately, some of the even really, really good Enneagram teachers out there in the world haven't been very open to new ideas about the subtypes. They kind of want to keep teaching what they taught before. And in my view, the Naranjo version is it's just more complete. There's more information there. And so when I learned it, I was like, whoa, the subtypes thing, like this version has so much more than everything else, including the countertypes. And so some people who don't know the Naranjo version don't know the countertypes, and they mistype people because they don't know what a self-preservation 4 is, because there is no self-preservation 4 in the 9 types, or in a lot of versions of the subtypes. There's no social 7, which is a 7 that looks like a 2, a 7 that goes against gluttony and wants to sacrifice their desires for an ideal of service. So social 9 is a type that gets mistyped a lot because they look like a 3 or a 2. So it's really important to know the countertypes. So I'm really glad that a lot of people are asking about the countertypes, because it's really good. It's important to know, especially if you're still looking for your type, or if you're someone who helps other people, even your friends, find their types, because it's something that not everyone knows about, that sheds a lot of light on, even when people do find their types. If you're a 3 that didn't relate to the description of this, the normal type description is all about social 3 and not about sexual 3 or self-preservation 3. Now, self-preservation 3 is the countertype. It's a 3 that wants to look good and have a good image and be really successful, but feels kind of embarrassed about wanting to look good and thinks it's kind of bad form to brag because they want to be good and not just look good. They want to be sort of morally good. And so they feel uncomfortable self-promoting, and they feel uncomfortable with recognition sometimes. Even though they want it, they feel uncomfortable wanting it. They feel uncomfortable being competitive with others. So the self-preservation 3 won't relate to a lot of the typical type descriptions. And so one of the things that gets me going is when people treat the Enneagram superficially, and I think not knowing the subtypes and not understanding the countertypes is sometimes when people think they know the whole system, but they just don't.
Can we do just a really quick, can you tell us what the countertype for each type is just really quickly? We'll start with—
You don't have to do description, just—
No, just,
Yeah. So for one, it's a little bit tricky because it's sexual one, but it's the only one that actively expresses anger. So the other two ones, you know, the passion of the type 1 is anger, but the other two ones kind of suppress it. But the sexual one is more openly angry. They're the one that feels like it's not wrong to be angry. And the anger flows in them more. Now, they sometimes suppress it, but some of the time they don't. So the sexual one is the one for the ones. Self-preservation 2, I'm the countertype. And sometimes people have told me I don't look like a 2, or I'm a little more 6-ish. Self-preservation 3, self-preservation 4, sexual 5, sexual 6, social 7, social 8, and social 9. So there are 3 of each.
Cool.
all right, cool.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to start moving into some mashup questions. So here we go. First one. Catlin asks, I'm an INTJ, the Myers-Briggs system, and a social 1. My co-pilot is extroverted thinking, effectiveness, and personality hacker recommends I focus my growth efforts here. If I understand Dr. Chestnut's first book, the growth path for 1 is to move toward 4, which would seem to suggest I move into my 10-year-old, in the Myers-Briggs system, or tertiary process of introverted feeling or authenticity. What are your thoughts on balancing these somewhat conflicting growth focuses?
All right, so—
Yeah, Antonia, you say something first. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was going to say really quick, could you give a description of what it looks like when a social 1 goes to 4?
So first I need to say, I wouldn't say the growth path for social 1 is going to 4. Now, I would say that a piece of the path of growth for the social 1 is going to 4 at some point. But first, I would work on some of the social 1 stuff, right? That's what I would do first. There's a lot of stuff for social 1s to work on, just having to do with social 1. Then, after they've done that for a while, and, you know, the social dominant instinct could be another thing to work on. And by the way, I also work with repressed instincts. So whatever, one instinct is dominant, one instinct is actually repressed or pushed out of consciousness, and one instinct is secondary, what I call secondary. But then the first thing the 1 needs to do after they work on social dominance and social 1 stuff, and there's a list of things to do there, after that, then they have to work on 7. Right? So the first thing they do after they work on their 1 stuff and their social instinct is go to 7. You always go against the arrow before you go with the arrow, because anything the 1 does at 4 is going to be unsustainable. Even if they create some change, it's going to be temporary if they haven't done their work at 7 first. 7 is the first balancing point of 1. It's the one against the arrow. It's going back in time, back against the arrow, because the Enneagram is also a time machine. It's going back in time and getting in touch with the primary balancing point, which is not being so serious, being playful and fun and light and out of the box thinking. I mean, that's the first balancing point for 7, for 1s, is going to 7. After the 1 goes to 7 and goes back to 1 and integrates all that good work they did integrating the good 7 stuff, then after that, then they're ready to go to 4. So I would say going to 4 is a growth step for 1, but it's not the first one or even the second one. It's a little bit down the road. And when they go to 4, that's when they get into more of their feelings, more into their emotion, more into who they really are, instead of just trying to be good and perfect, being more creative, expressing themselves more as who they are, instead of more sort of doing things by the book or according to the rules. That's 4 is very important for 1s, but it's not the first step.
So that's fascinating, because I'm thinking about the growth model for an INTJ, and I'm hearing you say all sorts of really fascinating things about this is unmuted, right? All sorts of fascinating things about what a 1 would do. So can you give me a hint about when you said, oh, no, don't go to 4 yet. There's a bunch of stuff you got to do at 1 as a social 1. Can you just give like 1 or 2 bullet points about what that would look like?
Sure. So social ones, one of the things they need to do first is, it's called non-adaptability or rigidity, and social ones also, interestingly, even though they're social dominant, they end up being outside the group. And that's why we can't always stereotype social dominance as always being comfortable in the middle of the group, because social ones serve their group or community by being the one who knows the right way to do things and then teaching and modeling that for others. And so they end up sort of putting themselves outside the group a little bit sort of as the teacher, as the model. And they're very conscious of wanting to do the right thing because other people are looking at them, and again, a lot of this is unconscious. So social ones would never, I think, consciously want to set themselves above or think they're superior. But other people can sometimes experience them that way because they're sort of doing a lot of work to figure out what the right way is. And then they can kind of go, hey, I know the right way to do it. And you all should look at me because I'm going to show you how to do the right thing. And usually social ones are coming from a place of wanting to help people. And be of service, because it's like they feel kind of good that they know they figured out the right way to do it. My brother is a social one, so I know how this works really well. And by the way, my brother is a great example of this whole thing. Why? Because what is his job? He's an orchestra conductor in the opera in Germany, right? So he is literally outside the group, up on the podium, being the model of how to play, right? Being the one who's saying like, you all should be following me and I'm going to show you how to do it. And he even says like when someone's not playing right, he doesn't get too busy about correcting them. He stands up straighter and he gets more right. And he, like when he parks or when he cooks or when he eats, he's doing everything the right way because he imagines that other people are going to look at how he does it and he wants to model the right way to do it. And again, this is an instinctive survival strategy in a way, but it's also a way of helping others. But of course, it doesn't always work. Like none of these subtype strategies work because it takes us around in circles. And he ends up, just being sort of rigidly adhering to his right way. And so the growth path is learning not to be so rigid, learning to see how that other people can also have right ways, learning from others and not always putting yourself in the teacher position, expressing some vulnerability, like maybe you don't always know the right way. And maybe it's actually nice to be more a member of the group than the person who's a little bit outside teaching the group how to do things better.
So here's where there's a beautiful marriage between that and being an INTJ. So for an INTJ, the growth path of an INTJ is to get outside of their heads and their idealism around how things should be going, right? And them knowing the right way and kind of everybody else. I mean, not that Caitlin's like this because I know Caitlin, she's amazing. But like kind of everybody else is an idiot that they don't see it like they do.
Right.
Because
it's so clear. Right? It's so clear. It's like, this is the right way. Like they don't question it once they find it.
And their growth path is to get out of their head and their idealism into their function of extroverted thinking or effectiveness, which is stop trying to look for efficiency, stop trying to make it like perfect, make things as, I don't want to use the word rigid because you did, because I'm trying to not borrow your language just to show that there's a complementarianism here that isn't necessarily like the same thing. But there's a sense of looking for the effective strategy. And the effective strategy requires less rigidity. You can't just go with what you've already thought. You have to implement, you have to try it out, you have to create a system and a structure, but you also have to have some flexibility within that. And INTJs do their best when they're in a leadership position, modeling the things that they think that are the right way to go, but also having a little bit of flexibility in there so that they can adapt to the reality of the situation.
Right.
They get out of idealism.
Right.
So that would be the development of the co-pilot would actually not correlate for this INTJ social one. It would not correlate with arrow lines. It would correlate with the core work of a social one.
Right.
Then they, the two things that they can opt to go towards, depending upon the context of where they're at in their life and what would be the best, is they can either do work on lightening up and getting more present by getting into their extroverted sensing or sensation 3-year-old or inferior, which is them being more present to the moment, enjoying things more, doing self-care with their body, having more fun, which sounds like the 7.
And that's all 1 stuff too. Good 1 stuff. Yeah.
And they also can choose to go develop their tertiary 10-year-old function, which is introverted feeling or authenticity, where they have a more sympathetic place. That's the place where they learn to deal with their pride and actually go more towards being in simpatico with other human beings, understanding their emotions, and creative expression. So it sounds like there's a lot of crossover between these 2 types, and it doesn't sound like there would be any contradiction. So
not at all.
Yeah.
I love this. This is a great one. And I want to say a couple of things about what you said. First of all, I imagine there are some INTJs that are head types, but what's interesting
lots
is,
of 5s.
I bet, what's interesting is social 1s sometimes mistype as 5s. They're the social 1s are a lookalike of 5, and social 1 are the most intellectual of the 1s. So even though 1s are body-based types, social 1s are very heady, very intellectual, and it's almost like the anger of the 1 gets channeled into being the owner of the truth, being sort of the one who's the most knowledgeable, who knows. So there is a heady and idealistic, of course, aspect to this. But it's a lot of stuff that makes a lot of sense, being more flexible, lightening up. This is all 1 stuff. And then it sounds like there is a piece of being more authentic and getting more into your emotions. And that's maybe a piece of 4, but also a piece of 1. And also dealing with pride. And it's interesting because social dominants have a pride issue. So pride isn't just for 2s. It's all social dominants have an issue with being kind of a little bit self-important, let's say.
And all INTJs that have introverted feeling as their 10-year-old or tertiary function deal with pride as a defense strategy to not have to go into their other more hurt emotions. So pride becomes a manifestation of like sort of their first line of defense. And so they go to pride because if they get hurt, it was you did that to me and I don't have to take that from you. And so
or you're an idiot.
Yeah,
right.
Or you're just an idiot and I don't have to pay attention to you. And so they get to protect their emotions. So my suspicion is, and we're of the theory, and I think you probably buy this too, that pretty much any Myers-Briggs type can be any Enneagram type, right? For the most part. There's definitely trends.
There's probably things that cluster together, but I think it's hard to make 1-to-1 correlations in any sense.
And I would be surprised if there isn't a complementary path of growth, no matter what the Myers-Briggs and Enneagram combination is. And I think it's because growth is growth, right? Like it's just, it doesn't necessarily have to contradict each other. And so I think that was awesome, Catlin, thank you very much for asking it. And I think it's interesting. I'm sure as we did this, if you and I sat down and people of all different combinations came up, I'm sure there'd be a way of going like, well, thing you have to do for being a 4 is the same thing you have to do for being an ISFP. Let's talk about that. And I think, I have a feeling that they're never gonna require a person to go against what their mind's wiring would require them for growth. So,
you guys ready for another mashup question?
Yeah.
If you want to say more about all this, we could just keep talking about the one question forever, but I want to try to get to as many people as possible and also answer thoroughly. Yeah. So this comes from Cheryl. I'm an INFJ Enneagram type 2, which is probably another thing that clusters often. Would you agree with that as far as your determination?
INFJ 2, I see actually more INFJ 1s and 4s, but I think 2 is definitely one that people who use extroverted feeling it's not uncommon for them to be 2.
So I'm an INFJ Enneagram type 2 in a relationship with an INTP male. I feel I have to take initiative connecting with him all the time, and I start to feel exhausted and hurt and doubt if he actually loves me. When he goes into solitude, I don't know if I should be pushing him or if I should wait for him to come out. Any advice? Thanks.
Well, you didn't say what his Enneagram type is.
Yeah, Cheryl, if you want to add in his Enneagram type, we can probably answer for your sake, like as far as INFJ 2, we can speak to you directly, and him as an INTP. But if you think you know his Enneagram type, that might be really helpful for us.
Although she did mention she's an Enneagram 2, she didn't mention her subtype. So is there any advice for 2s maybe being a little emotionally pushy?
Yeah, so it's interesting because my teaching partner is a INTP. He's a 5. We don't know that this person's boyfriend is a 5. But I do think that now, how would you answer this? Maybe it'd be good for you to go first.
Sure. So, I'll go based on I'll go based on the person being pushed, and you can go based on the person pushing. All right. So, INTPs have feeling, extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony, as their 3-year-old or inferior function. Any type that leads with thinking is going to feel like that they're always out of their sandbox when it comes to their feeling aspect. It's going to feel like the most vulnerable part of who they are. And just like all of us, we don't want to expose the most vulnerable piece of who we are. And we're going to protect it. And we're going to have built all these protections against people getting to it until we get very assured that that person is not going to hurt that part of who we are. Now, an INTP is going to go to extroverted feeling. An extroverted feeling is connected feeling. It's not just going inside and introspecting and figuring out what their emotional state is. It's actually sharing an emotional experience with another person. It's extroverted feeling. So it's connecting with another person and sharing your emotions with them and having them share their emotions with you. And so it's also very associated with things like, how are you responding to me emotionally? Are you approving of me or disapproving of me? And most of the time when an INTP is dealing with a lot of emotions, one of the reasons why they hide is because they also don't necessarily want to blow up in front of you. Because INTPs almost always have a trigger point where their extroverted feeling explodes when they can't harbor or hold their emotions anymore. And so instead of being in moments where they embarrass themselves by exposing themselves to all these emotions that maybe they don't understand, and they have no understanding or awareness or capacity to process necessarily on their own, sometimes they'll go into hiding so that they don't push that emotional experience onto you. Now, I don't know this person. I don't know what his past is. I don't know what he's dealing with. I don't know your guys' level of vulnerability with each other. I don't know how safe he feels with you, or if this is a new or an old relationship. And I don't know if he's harboring a time period of extreme emotion or if he's got a lot of grief in the past. All of these are modifiers in your relationship. I just know his 4 letters, and so I'm talking about those 4 letters. So apply those 4 letters to your context because you're going to know a ton more than I do. I just know that INTPs have a tendency to separate themselves from people that when they're feeling emotional because they don't want to expose the most vulnerable part of who they are. They don't want to explode on loved ones if they feel like they're being emotionally overwhelmed, and they don't want to be they don't want to be out of control. They don't want to be out of their sandbox. They don't want to be in a space where they may do or say something that doesn't make any sense to them, and later on they regret it. So, as a fellow NTP, I'm a little bit more in touch with my emotional experience, but I know that blow up thing because I do that blow up thing, right? I'm just a little bit less self-conscious about it than an INTP would be. And I think for me, when I'm feeling overly emotional and I feel like Joel's picking, right? Like he's trying to get in there and I don't feel like I'm ready for him to get in there, I also do a separation from him. And it's because I don't understand them yet. So if you come ask me what my emotional experience is and I don't understand it, then I'm not going to be very helpful. Like if you're like, how are you feeling? I literally don't know. No, tell me what's going on for you. I literally don't know. No, seriously, you can open up to me. Yes, I understand I can open up to you. I literally do not know. I have not figured them out. So what Joel does for me, which is very kind, is he actually helps me navigate my emotions with me. He's been a great spelunker, helping me spelunk inside of my emotional experience. But the context has to be very conducive. I have to feel super safe. I have to feel ready. I have to feel like he's not going to exploit anything I tell him or he tells me. Like there will be no weaponization of it at all. And if I feel like there will be any weaponizing of what we do, I won't talk, right? Like I have to feel super safe in this and that it's not going to be used against me later. And I also have to I have to feel free to share without being pushed to share. So it's more of an offering than it is a request. Does that make sense? It's like, I'm here for you if you need to talk this through. Like, I'm totally available. And if you don't want to process this with me, I totally understand. I'm not going to hold it against you, but I am available to you. And if you're an INFJ, like, you're not just available, you're available for some serious processing. You can be a conduit for his emotional experience, not just understanding. Like, you can actually help him, like a dialysis machine, actually process through and actually get through, release some of these emotions, which is really great. So, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that before. If you have had that moment, you can call back to it and you can go, hey, remember that one time when we blah, 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 blah. I'd like to be available to you to do that again. And if he's just super, super, super self-protective, then you've got to figure out, like, if you literally will never share an emotion with you, you've got to figure out whether or not you're okay with being in that kind of relationship. But if it's just a matter of like, him not wanting to go to a place that is a dark place for him, that he doesn't have, like, his introverted thinking has not sussed it out. One good thing to remind him is that all of us that use extroverted feeling, we must process our emotions out loud. Like, that's how we process them. We process them through communication. They're not introverted feeling, it's extroverted feeling. We understand ourselves, we understand our emotions by putting them out in the world and hearing ourselves say them, hearing another person reflect it back to us. That's how we process. So reminding him that he uses that processing, like, that's how he processes, that you're available to him, make it an offering, make sure that you validate and verify that you would never weaponize it against him. And then, hopefully that would be something that would help open him up. So what would you say is the INFJ or the 2 trying to get those emotions?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say I'll add one short thing. And that is based on what my business partner, who's also very, very close friend, says to me about being an INTP and also a 5. This person may not be a 5, but he says, if you have something important to tell me that you want me to respond to, especially if it's emotional, like, tell me and then go away.
Yeah.
Because he needs time to be by himself to process his emotions. And if I'm just sitting there looking at him like, okay, when are you going to tell me how you're feeling? It just doesn't work. And, express yourself, say how you're feeling, say what you might need from him or what you like to hear from him, and then go away. And try not to be attached to him being a certain way or being like you, but just be open to what his experience is and give him space. And I think might be a good policy.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one thing that I have noticed about myself. I don't know if all people who use extroverted feeling feel this way, but I will anchor an emotion to a physical location. So if I'm feeling overwhelmed and a person is pushing to try to get me to communicate, just being in that physical location will actually overwhelm me to a place where I can't talk. So one of the best ways to get me talking is actually to go on a walk with me, so that I can't anchor my emotion to the physical location. I can't get stuck in the emotion, if that makes sense. This is probably very weird and woo-woo to everybody. Those of you who use extroverted feeling, let me know if this works for you too. But if somebody wants me to talk about my emotions, if they take me for a walk and just kind of like, offer, oftentimes I find myself just sort of in the zone of talking about it. So, but if I feel like I have to sit down and talk about an emotion, I'll get completely overwhelmed by it. But it's almost like every step is me shaking the emotion off. It's like a really weird phenomenon. So take him for a walk and see what happens.
So the other thing for you as an INFJ, and this is as a feeler myself, when you're in a relationship with a thinker person, be ready for the things that they share with you to be somewhat harsh. Because they don't, like, if they're going to go into a vulnerable space and he's going to share his truth with you and you provide him that space, the things he says might trigger you. Let me just put it that way. Because it totally says, like, wow, I can't believe you just said that to me. Like, that was very true, but my goodness, that really hit to the core. So as a feeler, I think that's one of the things we have to work on, is being able to go, that was love for her to say that to me, that truth, that it's seemingly harsh thing. Actually giving a gift, just bearing the soul, sharing exactly what was going on. So that's just something to be thinking in mind as a feeler, as feelers move through the world with relationships with thinkers. So another mashup question here. Is this from Carla? One of the reasons I highlighted this is a couple people were saying this is very well worded and asked, so I thought that was really cool. So I zoomed to it. But Carla's also one of our profile training students, and she's been to one of your workshops, Beatrice.
Oh, Carla, yeah.
So she knows both of our systems. She's actually gone through some of our classes, so she understands kind of the approach we take. So this might be informative to help, on one of these specific questions. So I'm just going to zoom in here, then we'll kind of go back into the main thing. So Carla asks, 5 sexual with a very close self-pres. She's an ENFP. My growth path is definitely continuing to kick my extroverted thinking out of the way to serve my introverted feeling rather than the other way around. But my sexual and self-pres instincts are also at odds with each other, specifically with creative and esoteric work not being a realistic or practical pursuit. She was raised by a self-pres 1. How can I make sure that self-pres and extroverted thinking don't hijack my sexual and introverted feeling, and let go of the fear that the world is overwhelming and create esoteric pursuits, and creating creative exoteric pursuits won't be sustainable and meet my real world needs? You both understand the question?
I do.
Okay.
I think so. You go first.
Sometimes reading out loud is not my strength.
So since I know you well, Carla, I would say that continue to give yourself permission to be in your creative flow. Give yourself permission to be in your introverted feeling. Pursue all of those things that are your growth path as an ENFP and as a sexual 5. And also, don't forget that as a person who is into growth as you are, because I know how into growth you are, there's going to be a next step. And that is in the balancing of your introverted feeling and your extroverted thinking, which is continue to pursue your creativity, continue to pursue the things that are more esoteric, and also don't forget to balance them with a practical application, something that will help you sustain your life, which I think is both extroverted thinking and self-pres, right? Both of those things are about life sustenance. So it's not a matter of pushing those away all the time, at least from my perspective. I don't think you need to think about it in terms of pushing your TE away or extroverted thinking away. It's a matter of perpetually giving yourself permission to be in that creative, introverted feeling space, and then figuring out ways to balance your extroverted thinking by bringing it in, by asking, how can I amalgamate this creativity into something that also has an impact in the world, that's also effective, that also helps me helps me create a sustainable life. Because if you're only ever in your introverted feeling, right, not only are you not honoring your other functions, but also you will be untethered, right? Like you'll, what is the phrase? Of no earthly value. What's the phrase?
So heavenly minded, you're of no earthly value.
Right. So one of the challenges that introverted feeling has to watch out for, especially when it's in an ENFP, is being so heavenly minded, right? So up here in the abstract that earthly value piece isn't represented. And as an ENFP, as you go through your growth process, you're going to actually get more and more practical. That's actually where you go. Now, if you never give yourself permission to be creative, then you die a little inside. And that's why we tell ENFPs, make sure you get into introverted feeling, make sure you get into that authentic space, make sure that you're in a place where you're doing things that are highly creative and very expressive, because otherwise you just die a death of 1,000 cuts, and that's no good. But once you've given yourself permission to be there and you feel like you have a strong relationship to that creative process, then now you have to plug in those more practical elements. So it's not like you never go there, it's just you go there after you go to the creative and lock that piece in. And if you feel like you're there, if you feel like you're at a place where you give yourself full permission to be in that abstract, esoteric, creative place, now don't kick the extroverted thinking away. And I suspect don't kick the self-preservation away. Allow it to balance you out and allow it to give you that ballast of something that's a little bit more, because then you'll have an impact in the world. It won't just be for you. It won't just be for you to be able to be in your stuff. It'll also be something that you can share, will give you rootedness, will give you a through line, and will be something you can bring to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say exactly the same thing. And I think from, in Enneagram language, sexual 5s tend to express their, what you might call introverted feeling through creativity. So sexual 5s are more connected to their feelings than the other 5s, and they tend to be they almost need a creative outlet as a way to express their emotions because they don't feel comfortable expressing their emotions in other ways, in more overt or direct ways. It's almost like they need a medium. So creativity is great for sexual fives, but totally agree. It also needs to be brought down to earth because sexual fives also can get caught up in this search for like the ultimate, the ideal, and not really be more realistic about what's possible or what has value that isn't like the ultimate ideal, most esoteric, most, abstract thing. And so I would agree with everything you said about needing to be more practical, tether that the creativity and both the intellectual part of that and the way that it's expressing something emotional maybe isn't so comfortable to express too much, but tether that to something that's more in the earthly world, more practical, as a challenge, as a way of making both the sexual instinct and the five sort of introversion more, bringing that out more.
Cool.
Yeah.
So we've had a couple specific questions. I'm going to zoom to a more general question. This is from Joyce. Are there any trends in relationship compatibility or even types that are generally more drawn to each other? So maybe we start with you, Beatrice, then we'll bounce over here.
I mean, I think sometimes you see a lot of certain kinds of couples, but I don't think that there are any types that are, say, more well-suited than others. I think the main variable for suitability in relationship is level of awareness. I think a self-aware person who's really working on themselves and trying to be more conscious is always going to be easier to be in relationship with than someone who isn't. Someone who's, not really working on themselves, not that self-aware, not that interested in being on a growth path. That person, no matter what type they are, is going to be more fixated and just harder to relate to because they're in their patterns and they're not able to see beyond them and kind of get over their ego. That said, sometimes opposites attract, but I've seen people of the same type together lately. So I don't think there's any specific type, and I think any types can be really good together, especially if they're working on themselves.
So in Myers-Briggs, we talk about the difference between a compatibility relationship and a growth relationship. So there's certain types that are more naturally sort of similar in their disposition, and they're highly compatible, but then they end up having a bunch of blind spots in life, and so all of their antagonism ends up being like, I thought you handled that. Well, I thought you handled that. And then on the other side are the types that are growth relationships, which are people who are very different. Yeah, like they're very different in their dispositions, but they usually cover each other's blind spots. And so what they have to do is they have to figure out how to do a lot of like sort of meeting in the middle. And neither one is necessarily that much better than the other. It just sort of depends. And I think I read someplace, it's been a long time. I've been quoting it for like a decade now, so I lost where I read it. But I read that the number one indicator of success in relationships are shared values and interests. So if you have shared values and interests, it doesn't matter what personality type combination you are, because you're able to meet at that place. And then when people grow, when they grow apart, usually what they're growing apart in is that their values have shifted or their interests have shifted. And so that's the biggest predictor. And I think that's the one that I would recommend people focus the most on is interests and values.
Yeah. Sometimes we say something about dominant instinct, like people who have the same dominant instinct can kind of like what you said, they can be more compatible, but it's not necessarily as interesting. People who have different dominant instincts or instinctual sequences, there's more difference, but it can be kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So let's see here. All right. So question. This is from Victoria. I'm interested in your opinions on how an INFJ, social sexual, 9 wing 1 countertype. There we get all that? Yeah. INFJ, social sexual, 9 wing 1 countertype. Mother of a child with special needs can get out of the vacillating traps of 9 inertia toward motherhood. The extroverted sensing, extroverted feeling loop. An INFJ sanity keeping, pulling away into introversion mode, introverted intuition, introverted thinking loop, and gain momentum toward focusing on her own agendas in terms of life's work, purpose, passions, projects, etc., apart from children and family. You want to summarize how you understood that question?
Okay, so I'm hearing it. How would these two models recommend this INFJ, social 9, with a child who is a mother with a child who has special needs?
Correct.
Get out of her trap of the 9 inertia problem. So I'm not sure what the 9 inertia challenge is, traps of 9 inertia towards motherhood. I don't know what the 9 inertia towards motherhood would be for a 9. That would
maybe it's like focusing too much on the role, being the role of mother, or focusing on the children and the family, and not focusing enough on herself.
Okay, and gain momentum towards focusing on her own agenda in terms of life's work, purpose, etc. So that's your side of it. And then my side of it is, how does an INFJ get out of over-mothering and wanting to just then retreat into her own introverted loop, and apply her energy towards working for her own, getting her own needs met and her own agenda.
I'm going to pick on you, Victoria. Ask simpler questions.
Yes, it's very complicated. All right, so I'm going to let you take yours. Do you want to take yours first?
Victoria just answered yes.
Okay, so
you basically summarized that correctly. All right.
So sure, yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think that she needs to have more time alone, and I know that might be hard with a child and a special needs child, but whatever it takes to get, maybe the partner to take over some of the time. So having more time on her own to kind of focus on herself will be good. I also think getting in touch with any sadness associated with maybe feeling constrained by the mother role, or working really hard to support the family and not having enough time for herself, or not feeling a sense of belonging in the world. That's going to be a good thing, to get in touch with her feelings around her situation and not being in touch with herself. And I also think, you kind of, I almost feel like she kind of knows this already in the way she asked the question, recognizing that it's really important not to over-identify with the role of mother, or the role of, the person who works really hard to support the family, and at the expense of focusing on herself. And so it could be, creating routines where she has time on her own, or she does certain things by herself, or she focuses on certain priorities, and almost having people who hold her accountable, because I know the 9 inertia can be hard, but having certain things that she commits to doing, have people support her and hold her accountable, and just like really making, like, maybe she has a night a week or a couple of days a week where she really gets some time by herself to focus on what she wants to focus on, and have put more center of gravity on her own sense of purpose.
So social 9s, one of the ways that sloth shows up for them is sloth towards really having like a personal preference, right? Having knowing what one's like doing the work of going inside and knowing what your preferences and what your desires are. Is that accurate?
Sure. Yeah. It's hard to access your own priorities and then act on behalf of your own priority.
So one of the challenges that INFJs can have is that they can lose themselves and their identity in other people. And I would imagine that a 9 would also have this challenge. Yeah. So one of the things that, I have a very good friend who's a sociology professor that talked about the challenge of role-person merger, which is that you see this in, like professors a lot, is that their professorhood is their role, and their identity merges with the role, and they no longer see themselves as having an identity outside of the role. It's called role-person merger. And that's kind of what it sounds like right now, this idea of like, as a 9, it's so easy to sort of lose yourself. As an INFJ, it's easy to lose yourself into another person. And I would imagine it would be easy to lose yourself to a role. And so doing the work of separating yourself out from that role, not having role-person merger, but actually separating yourself out from the role of being a mother. And then the hard work you're going to have to do, and this is actually your INFJ work too, I wouldn't necessarily go to get into action. Social 9s are hard workers, right? Once they know what they want, right? Sometimes they get taken.
Whether they know what they want or not, usually not, they are hard workers.
Yeah. So the question isn't like, how do you make your dreams come true in whatever it is that you want to do, right? Because you're a hard worker. I'm assuming that as a social 9 that you're a hard worker, and a lot of INFJs are quite hard worker. They're very responsive. They've got more energy than their INTJ counterparts usually, because they have that responsive piece of them that will get into action. And so with extroverted feelings. So to me, what it kind of sounds like, and this is why I would piggyback on what Beatrice was saying, which is time. The time is not just for self-care, because that's usually what we say. INFJs, make sure you have time for self-care. But that extroverted feeling or harmony function, that's all about getting needs met. You've got to go inside and figure out, like, do the hard work of figuring out what your specific needs are. Do the work of what it is that you want. How do you want to impact the world? How do you want to affect it? Now, if you've already done that work, if you've already gone into and you know what it is you want, but you're just trying to take the trajectory away from 100% focusing on your kid and then do a little bit of work, like for yourself, then that's a role person merger issue. And I would probably look up that phrase, role person merger, and take some suggestions on how to stop conflating those two things. But this idea of taking the time to know exactly what it is you want, and then building a system. Because the thing is, we talk about extroverted thinking as being systems builders, but extroverted feeling are also systems builders. They just build systems of people. They build networks of people, and they build systems around getting people's needs met. And that includes yourself. So use your extroverted feeling to first know what your needs are, know what your desires are, know what your wants are. Recognize that you are also a person who needs to get your needs met, and then build a network or a system around you to facilitate those needs. And that includes of yourself. And then do maybe a little bit of work around separating out your identity from that role. So without knowing more specifics, it might be hard to do a better diagnostic than that. But that would be my recommendation as an INFJ.
So let's stick with, by the way, Beatrice, do you want to say anything else?
Just one last thing
Sure.
is sometimes it's really interesting to look at the repressed instinct. And in her case, she's social sexual. So self-preservation is repressed. So that may be another factor of her not taking, like, self-preservation 9s are the ones that like to be by themselves. They're a little bit more like going and doing their own thing. And also self-pres repressed people tend to put themselves in danger, which could even take the form of doing too much for other people and not taking care of what you really need and not taking the time to figure out what you want.
Yeah. I was actually I was editing today some of the stuff we recorded when you were here at the studio talking about the repression stuff. So that's very fresh in my mind from the bonus I'm getting ready to put into the Enneagram roadmap. It's all really good content. So I want to stick with the 9, and I want to shift over. This person's a 9, wing 1, so a 9. I don't know the sexual, I don't know the subtype, excuse me. But INTP is the type. So we're shifting from INFJ to an INTP 9 now. So I'm having trouble figuring out my instinctual variant between social and sexual. I feel social, but identify with a fusion of the two. Any easy way to determine the difference for a 9? Can 9s merge instinctual variant subtypes?
So 9s who are sexual dominant merge more with specific others than social 9s do. Social 9s merge more with the group. So but they tend to be, social 9s tend to have a little bit more of their own center of gravity because they are, they're doing so much, and they tend to be a little more opinionated, and sexual 9s lose themselves more in another person.
Okay. Any comments before I move to the next one?
Yeah, that's
okay. So Leanne writes in, hi, Joel, Antonia, Beatrice. I've heard it said that the MBTI only focuses on cognitive functions, while the Enneagram includes head, heart, and gut centers, making it more rounded. Is this true? When doing deep work with the shadow, what should I be looking for in each model? I'm an INFP on the Myers-Briggs system and a 9 in the Enneagram.
We're lousy with 9s tonight, aren't we?
Lots of 9s. They're everywhere. They must like to come to webinars.
Yeah.
Any comments just in general, Antonia, to start off?
Well, I would say that cognitive functions don't necessarily preclude the other elements. Like the Enneagram is very elegant in that it has a body, a heart, and a head center. And those are the centers of intelligence. But it all still lives in your mind. Like all these things, like even though there are neurons that live in your heart and neurons that live in your stomach or in your gut, the cognitive functions would also occupy all those neural pathways as well. And so it's not that cognitive function means specifically thinking function. It means that it's living in your neural network. So extroverted feeling and introverted feeling could easily be considered elements that are associated with a form of feeling intelligence. The sensing functions could easily be considered body intelligence. Different forms of especially extroverted sensing could be considered body intelligence. Not that there's going to be a one-to-one correlation, like all the people who use extroverted sensing are automatically going to be guts. All the people who are using feeling functions are automatically going to be, feeling centers. It's sort of, these two models in my mind sort of show how we actually access all these things, but we access them in sort of different ways. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that cognitive functions should be taken as cognition or thinking or cerebral only. It's just that it's indicating that these are functions that live inside of our neural pathways. And so I think extroverted sensing is probably one of the best examples of this, in the sense that extroverted sensing they always have extremely high kinesthetic intelligence. That means that their intelligence is living throughout their entire network, their entire body network. And so even though that's a cognitive function, it's not necessarily like a thinking function. It's a kinesthetic function. So that's probably how I would lay that out. Now, on the other side, which is when I'm doing shadow work, what should I be focusing on each system? For Myers-Briggs, a lot of shadow work can be found in your inferior function. I know a lot of people like to go to shadow functions, which are the 4 cognitive functions that aren't represented in your car model. And there is sometimes work to be done in there too. But I would say that if you're going to be doing shadow work, the place that I would focus on is how your inferior or 3-year-old function is sort of whispering in the back of your ear. How is it controlling you? How is it influencing you in ways that you might not be consciously aware of? And so that would be where I would go to do some shadow work if you're having issues there. What would you say for Enneagram, B?
For Enneagram, if she's a 9, there are specific blind spots that 9s have. So again, people's shadow can be individual to some extent, but there are places to look if you're a 9, and that is anger. And getting more in touch with your anger, your sense of power. 9s tend to be very modest and not own their power in the world. So what's, looking into, the blind spots associated with your type, having your own agenda, being more pushy with people, saying things that are controversial, all these things that 9s tend to not see, that don't get on their view screen. I think it's important to look in those areas to see what your shadows might be.
Cool. Mm-hmm. All right, so we're going to move over here to INTP sexual 5. So I'm an INTP and sexual 5. I think maybe sometimes I get really caught up in the stress of trying to manage my inferior extroverted feeling. And then I remind myself that I should focus more on my co-pilot. Do you think that being a sexual 5 could make me tend to be more focused in some way on my inferior function, extroverted feeling, sort of obsessed with it? If it's the solution to one or to one-on-one connection that I want. So this is the solution to one-on-one connection that I want. But at the same time, it seems almost impossible to navigate.
That is a really interesting question. So basically, as an INTP, this person would have extroverted feeling as their 3-year-old or inferior function. But we always talk about extroverted feeling as the place where we do a lot of like emotional connection between people. So as a sexual 5, if he's totally, I'm assuming it's a he. I don't know why.
Alex. I don't know.
Okay. This person, if they are maybe sort of idealizing this idea of having like that perfect special someone, as a sexual 5 tends to do, is that maybe why they're obsessed with their 3-year-old function of extroverted feeling and not doing the work they should be doing in their co-pilot, which would be extroverted intuition. So would you be willing to speak a little bit about a sexual 5's relationship with connection, one-to-one connection with other people?
Right. And I think 5s need to share more of their feelings, not just with one special person, but with more people. So in other words, they tend to have feelings, but they're sort of more buried deep inside, and it's hard for them to share and feel comfortable sharing. So that's one thing. And then what was the exact question you asked about connection? And again, sexual fives tend to focus on finding that perfect person to have a relationship with. And part of looking for the perfect person is there's a really high bar of trust that's needed in order to open up and share feelings. And that serves as a defense against sharing feelings and connecting. Because like if you have to find the perfect person or the ideal person that you can really open up to, you may not find that person. Or if you do find that person, maybe you can open up to more people. So they tend to, because of it's so idealistic about connection, they tend to cut themselves off from more opportunities or pushing themselves to do it with more people, or at least try with more people when they haven't found the special person.
Well, and if an INTP is hyper focusing on extroverted feeling, they're hyper focusing on something that isn't going to be a natural talent for them. So it's in some ways going to be slightly self-sabotaging as well, because that's kind of what I'm hearing. It's almost like a psychological loop you put yourself in. Like, I've got to have the perfect person, and so therefore nobody will do, and so therefore I don't have to share until I find that perfect person. So the growth path for an INTP would be getting into extroverted intuition, which is being willing to take opportunities as they come, being willing to take risk, getting outside, trying new things, meeting new people, traveling, doing all sorts of things that get you outside of yourself so that, maybe you find yourself in a bar in Australia pouring out your feelings to some stranger and you never see him again, right? That would be extrovert intuition. That all of these things that feel like that they would be dangerous to you, which really aren't dangerous, but they feel risk-taking and dangerous because they're completely out of your comfort zone. That's the growth of path for an INTP. And so if you really do actually want the relationship that you're obsessing over, it's not going to be in idealizing it. It's not going to be in sort of hiding yourself away and hoping that person shows up on a silver platter. It's going to be getting outside yourself, going and getting outside your comfort zone, going and taking risks, going and meeting lots of new people, and getting a better impression of how the patterns of how the world actually works outside of your idealization, outside of what you think you know about how reality works. For INTPs, getting outside is how you get feedback on whether or not your initial impressions are accurate. And so getting outside your comfort zone as much as possible is the best path for an INTP to actually meet the person that they want to be with. So would that be compatible with the sexual fives growth path as well?
Yeah. Yep. I would say yes.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're coming down on the 2-hour mark here soon.
Yeah.
And I don't want to wear Beatrice out too much. We can just keep going, but I want to give you some space.
We should probably do another question or two.
Yeah.
And then
So
okay.
again, I'm going to try to highlight a couple questions here. So tons of 9s. I really don't know
Should
where.
we go to another type?
And sexual fives.
Yeah, 5 and 9, man.
Let's actually go to another type because we've actually focused on 9s a lot.
I'm trying.
Is it all 9s? Seriously?
So answer this question about 9, Beatrice, while I look for more things. No, not all 9s, but I'm trying to go through embedded questions and try to highlight things and stuff like that. So do self-preservations 9 merge? Sarah's asking, do SP9s merge? I've never related in a way to merging with another person, though merging into a role does make some sense to me.
I think all 9s merge, but self-preservation 9s merge less than the other 2 9s. And they like being by themselves more. They're more about comfort and routines and the things they like to do and practical, concrete aspects of life than they are about merging completely with another person.
Okay.
All right. We might have,
looking
that was just
for
to that person.
Oh, whoops.
So Liz Cortez said that she made an ENTJ social 3 question. Can you copy and paste that so it goes to the bottom of the chat list? And so
all
we can.
Panelists, there we go. Julie, your focus is mind blowing me right now. All right, so let's see here. So I'm trying to get to.
Because if you copy paste it, it'll pop up and we can talk about a 3.
I mean, there's a lot of comments in here, and I could probably pull questions from them, but it's just there's so much in here. If you would copy and paste that would be great.
Somebody says, what's more dominant, your Myers-Briggs type or your Enneagram type? Well, obviously the most important is your Myers-Briggs type. I think that this is what's so fascinating about both of them is that I think that they come at things from a different enough angle. I would say that from my observation, Myers-Briggs is a very direct path of growth. Myers-Briggs is not, it gives you can spend a lot of time growing in Myers-Briggs and your Myers-Briggs type, but it has a simplicity to it. But the Enneagram, there's a lot to the Enneagram. There's so many different places that you can go with Enneagram. And what I've noticed is that they're very compatible. So how I've been using it is of course I mastered Myers-Briggs first. And I've been noticing how as I get more and more into my Enneagram subtype of being a sexual 3, I use what I know about my mind's wiring in Myers-Briggs to be compatible with my growth path in the Enneagram. Like I just sort of merge them together and I make sure that they have that complementary piece. But the Enneagram goes further. I mean, I would say that it has so much more content to explore. Now, of course, if you're into socionics, you'll go, no, it doesn't, because socionics. And you might not be wrong. Socionics goes pretty far. But when it comes to cognitive functions, and if you're going to be mastering those first 4 functions, I wouldn't say either one is dominant. I would say that they kind of explain different aspects of who you are, and they I think very beautifully complement each other in your growth path. What would you say, B?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to answer the question is what's more dominant than the other. I mean, I just think they're both, describe lenses on the world or ways of operating systems, let's say. So I think it's hard to say what's more dominant.
Okay.
That's a good answer.
A very good answer. Okay, so my apologies.
Did you find the
I
INTJ?
just can't, but let me ask a different question here, and I can keep trying to look here. Personality hierarchy talks about the notion, this is from Aaliyah, this is from Heather, excuse me. Personality hierarchy talks about the notion of intuitive blending. Intuitives blending into a sensor-dominant world and the expectations around them. Do you find that there is a current societal center of gravity in our culture? It feels to me like 3s and 1s get a lot of love in the world that I live in. So sometimes I wonder whether me typing as a 3 is correct, or I'm being biased by the societal influences around me and how I'm being encouraged to act.
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say there's a societal sense of like what's acceptable? Like, do we go through fads in the Enneagram of I mean, right now, tonight, it seems like 9s are pretty popular, fatting wise on the show.
Well, I think that America is a 3 culture. So 3s get rewarded for being 3s, which actually isn't good for 3s because, it's sort of like when we have more pain points, that's kind of what sometimes moves us to a growth path, suffering. And I worked with a 3 recently. He was very successful at a really high level at a finance firm, really good looking, great golfer. Everything was going his way. And I was tasked with being, his Enneagram coach by the leadership development program he was in, but he was saying, I have no reason to change anything I'm doing because all the rewards that are providing to me are rewarding my personality. Why on earth would I change? I'm being rewarded for doing everything as a 3. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes that can make it hard for 3s both to see themselves. 3s, Naranjo said that Americans are 3 blind. Like 3s sometimes don't find themselves as 3s. They type as their image or what's valued in their culture or in their context, and they don't find themselves as 3s. Or there are some people that type as 3s and aren't 3s, although more often I see people typing as something else when they're really a 3. There's a lot of people I've met and I'm like, I think that person's actually a 3, especially since people don't know what a sexual 3 or a self-pres 3 is. They just know the social 3. And so I think sometimes 3s get mixed up because the American culture is so 3-ish.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Mm-hmm. So I know we're coming up with the top of the second hour right now. So Beatrice, thank you so much for being with us. Beatrice created a program with us called Enneagram Roadmap, and it would be inappropriate for me not to mention it. If you're more interested in learning about the Enneagram system, we worked really hard. She flew to our studios twice now, recorded content the first time for the core of the program, which goes through all 27 subtypes, the growth path for all those 27 subtypes. And then we flew her to the studio again a couple months ago and recorded more content, bonus content, to talk about the instincts, the way they repress, the way they're overdone, just a bunch of stuff that I've been editing today, so it's all in my head. So it's really good stuff. Enneagram Roadmap, we'd love to invite you to come over and check it out. You can find that at personalityhacker.com Enneagram Roadmap. So personalityhacker.com/Enneagram Roadmap. Find out all about that course, which we'd love you to be a part of. And this was a little bit of a test to see the mashup elements of Myers-Briggs and Enneagram. I think it was successful, and I think we got a lot of, we didn't even get to like tons of questions. There's been so much conversation, community building in here. We've had people from all over the world tuning in, which is really cool. So I think we're going to have to probably find times, Beatrice, to be able to do more of these in the future, to reach people, help us bridge more of these two systems, because I think there's a lot of crossover, a lot of good stuff and growth that can happen from both. And I think I can say for you too, Beatrice, the three of us would love for you, if you're watching and listening right now, to really understand these systems and how they can help you grow as a person, how they can help you become the best version of yourself, to work on the parts of yourself that maybe are a little scary to work on. But these are tools that can help you along the way. It's like scaffolding as you're building the building of your life, right? It's the scaffolding can help you find your way. So
can I say a little bit of something about Enneagram Roadmap and how I think it's the perfect accompaniment to what I spend a lot of my time doing live. My business partner and I offer live inner work retreats. You know, we offer them mostly in San Francisco, London, Cairo in Egypt, Sao Paulo, Brazil, and coming soon, China. And in those inner work retreats, we do deep work with the Enneagram. But we don't really teach the basics. We kind of get right into the deeper work. So Enneagram Roadmap is like the perfect thing to do if you're wanting to do some deep work as a prelude to kind of doing one of our inner work retreats, or even doing one of our professional workshops where we help practitioners learn to use the Enneagram in a deep and accurate way. So we'd love to see you at one of our 5-day programs, but Enneagram Roadmap is really a good thing to do first, to kind of, first of all, just, you know, enter into the Enneagram, I think, in a deep way, and how it can be used as a growth tool and what the system is all about. But also as an introductory workshop you can do in the comfort of your own home before you come and do something deeper with us, which we'd love to have you do.
Well, and to piggyback on that, Joel was mentioning when we flew Beatrice out again, when we were in Florida to record more content. As you mentioned, we've been listening to that all day long because we've been doing some editing on it. And I had forgotten how good those conversations were, because we were talking about things that, we were talking about instinctual stacks. So, you know, people have been talking, you know, I'm a self-pres sexual, or I'm a social, you know, sexual, or whatever, self-pres. And then you just kind of hinted. And then we have the ones that's repressed, right? And in the Enneagram Roadmap, the content that we were creating, you mentioned how it was like a beach ball underneath water, that we do an elaborate balancing act to try to repress it and push it down so we don't have to see it. And so we talked about those things about stacks and what it looks like to have each of those instincts, what it looks like when one of those is your repressed beach ball underneath the water, and what it means to have one that's dominant. And it was
when it explodes.
When it explodes, yeah, because that beach ball will come up sometimes and surface, and what it looks like when your repressed instinct explodes. I mean, it's such good stuff. So that's now in the Enneagram Roadmap, or those are being uploaded right now, and they're it's just really amazing content. So I also would like to put my hat in the ring of recommending that right now, because we're releasing Enneagram Roadmap right now. It's a really good time to go check out that program.
So thank you so much, Beatrice, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. And we will talk to everybody very soon.
Okay.
Have a great evening,
everybody.
Right.
Bye.